Welcome to Mint Views. Today we are going to talk about the idea of willful defaults. And the big question is, should lists of willful defaulters, which are companies which have taken loans from banks, not paid them back, but have been judged to have the capacity to pay them back, should willful defaulters, should their names actually be disclosed? That's the big question we are going to debate today. As we know, the idea of willful default is actually a gray area. This is because judging whether or not a company has the capacity to pay back and hasn't paid back its loans is always a dicey judgment. So what do we have to say about this? Shrija, what's your opinion on this? Should we disclose these names? Should we not? These are companies. Famous names.
It's not a public defamation, but you're just providing information to the public. And given that the chart, or given that the petition was filed under the Right to Information Act, the premise of such an act is to uphold the transparency and ensure accountability of the institutions to the public. So when you make such a disclosure happen, you're actually fulfilling the remit of the law. But if the RBI, which it had done unfortunately in previous occasions, to withhold such an information, that means it does fail in its part to provide information to the public or fulfill its statutory duties to the the depositors and the entire banking system as a whole.
The reason we are debating this is because The Wire, that's an online news portal, has actually brought out a list of the RBI's top 30 willful defaulters, which had been withheld by the RBI, saying that the RBI's logic was that we cannot disclose this, it's not in the interests of the banking sector, of the economy on the whole, because there are several reasons that it could actually cause damage. That's why we are debating this. Rohit.
A willful default tag does not necessarily mean that the companies are guilty of wrongdoing. And in that light, it is unfair disclosing their names. It is unfair to these companies.
Yes, because it ends up possibly besmirching their name, and it's not clear whether or not these people are guilty of anything in violation of the law. That's a separate matter altogether. There is, of course, limited liability. A company, a person who invests in a company, his liability should be restricted to the money invested there. If the company goes bust, well, that's the company folding up. It may default. That doesn't mean the person himself actually has to pay the bank back. Is that a point there? Anant, what do you think?
No, you're right, but I think that should not be applied generally, and there are certain exceptions under the Companies Act to that particular provision, and in fact it's called lifting of the corporate veil, where the law decides not to distinguish between the two identities of the company and the individual. It treats both of them as the same. There are certain exceptions, so I think it cannot be generally applied. But to the point that Shrija made, I think she was advocating transparency through the RTI Act. I agree that there should be transparency, but there is something called a private contract also between the bank and the person who's taken the loan. So I think I'll try to make a little bit more, I'll take a little bit more nuanced stance that it should be only in the case where people have escaped the law, where you forfeit your rights to demand from the law to be treated at an equal platform as any other person charged of any such willful default. So there could be genuine cases where businesses have failed, and such businesses or their promoters should not be publicly defamed or publicly shamed.
Shrija, would you like to comment on that?
I would rather agree with Shrija, and I have a slightly contrarian view to what Anant said. I think it's in public interest to release the names of individuals and companies who have been classified as willful defaulters. You see, at the end of the day, it is public money, and these banks have not classified them as willful defaulters just for fun. There are various rights that these banks get when they do so. One of them is that these banks and institutions can actually replace the management of such companies that are classified as willful defaulters. Also, once a company is or an individual is classified as willful defaulter, he or the company cannot easily access credit. Not just that, such companies or such individuals cannot float a new venture for a period of 5 years. So by naming and shaming, if you can get public money returned, I think there is no harm in it. because for far too long this has actually become a pattern. Individuals and companies take loan, public money from PSU banks and simply choose not to pay back.
May I just add a point on over here on what Srijay has talked about? You know, we also need to be cognizant of the impact this will have on India's investment climate to the global investor. Think of what we are over here suggesting by public shaming is that we don't trust our own legal methods, we don't trust our own laws in recovery, and what we are trying to do is people who don't pay us back, we are going to publicly shame you. So that's a bad message to send out to foreign investors also who are worried exactly about this thing, that laws really don't get implemented in the country properly.
It is not that, it has got nothing to do with the trust or the lack of it in the judicial system. It is about people's need to know who are these defaulters, and they have every right to know it.
Can I stop you there? Willful defaulter hasn't yet been judged guilty by any legal process. This is actually a preliminary thing, a preliminary list. There needs to be an entire legal process before we can actually find whether, like I said, it's a gray area, whether or not there's genuine capacity to pay back and hasn't been paid back. Of course, we do know there are other cases where money has been diverted by these companies, various such issues of fraud tail some of these companies, but that still doesn't mean that the entire list of those classified as willful defaulters necessarily implies guilt in the absolute sense. I don't think the public at large is aware of these nuances, these differences, and they tend to, you know, paint them all with a single black brush. That could be dangerous. That could be dangerous to the credit culture. And I have a feeling the RBI on this was probably right, that we have to be very, very careful before we disclose lists of this nature, because it could actually cause some harm. Thank you.